Okay.
Gavin's going to say something.
Now, I tell you what Gavin's going to do. He's going to do more than say something. He's going to read the Mishnah. Hang on.
Give me an easy one. Oops, this looks hectic. Okay, it's a bit of an angle. I'll turn my computer. Mishnah. If one gives wool to a dyer to dye for him, and the cauldron burnt it, the dyer pays him the value of his wool. If he dyed it poorly, if the improvement to the wool exceeds the expenses of the dyeing, the owner pays the dyer the expenses, but not his fee. But if the expenses of dyeing exceed the improvement to the wool, the owner pays him only for the improvement. If he gave him wool to dye red for him and he dyed it black, or he gave it to him to dye it black and he dyed it red, Rabbi Meir says the dyer pays him the value of his wool. Rabbi Yehuda says if the improvements in the wool exceed the expenses of dyeing, the owner pays the dyer the expenses, but not his full fee. But if the expenses of the dyeing exceed the improvement to the wool, the owner pays him only for the improvement.
Good. Well read. Okay, so there's if you have a look, all right, there's different parts to it. The first thing is, what do we mean that the cauldron actually burnt it? So I actually had to look, commentary in Rashi, that part of the dyeing process was that it had to maintain at a relatively low temperature in order that the dye would take hold. But it had to be hot enough so that there would be absorption, but not too hard where it would obviously melt or burn away the wool, because the cauldron was too hot, it burned the wool. So if we looked at the 99th stuff, we're already on the 100. The wool was ruined immediately if you place it in an overheated cauldron, which means it's not as if, as we initially thought, it took 2 or 3 days for the dyeing process to take place, and it was known as garmi, direct, because it was consequential. It was because the effect of burning was immediate. So it was left too long in the cauldron. That's the bottom line. Now, the dyer, you've got to think of him as a paid custodian. Why are we using this sort of analogy? Because he's being paid for his services. So they still can fit in these macrocosmic categories. And because he's being paid for his services, he must make good the loss of item that was entrusted to him. And it was the same thing that we learned that matter in regard to slaughter. If an animal was brought to him and he didn't tie it down properly, we also covered that in the 99th stuff. Now, the Mishnah doesn't discuss in this particular case, the amount of compensation the dyer receives for the increase in the wool's value, because there was no increase in value. The wool was ruined completely. If you remember way back in many dafs ago, we learned that according to Rabbi Meir, that the dye that took hold increased the value of the wool, but he dyed it red instead of black and black instead of red. Then it wasn't a purposeful mistake, and therefore the physical change didn't affect acquisition because he wasn't a robber. It was a person that misunderstood. So he has to refund the cash value of the raw wool. In this case, there was no benefit to the dyer for doing it because the wool's completely lost. So it's not as if he can recover it by misdyeing the color. He, in fact, has lost everything completely because he has to reimburse the supply of the wool, which is the private person that brought the wool in for dyeing. Now, if you have a look at the word ka'ur, which is the Gemara's word, it means ugly. So what are we talking about here? It means it was dyed poorly. It was dyed ugly, and we're going to discuss what sort of could cause it. The one thing of it is inferior dye for sure. So what we learn in this Gemara is that the expense of dyeing includes basically the cost of the dye and the wood used to heat the cauldron. There's also the fee of the dyer's laborer, if he's hired one, or his own fee if he was the one that did the labor. Okay, and it's calculated as an ordinary wage cost. Now, in this case, obviously the dye is responsible, because if he's using an inferior dye product, he's considered as having committed an act of intentional damage. And therefore, he forfeits his right to the higher fee, because you see here that it says that if he actually dyed it of poor quality, then you pay him whatever's the lowest amount, meaning he doesn't have the upper hand. If the improvement exceeds the expenses, meaning the improvement of the dye, even though he dyed it poorly, it was worth maybe 10 zuz. Say he used top quality dye, guys, and it would have been worth 20 zuz, but now it was only worth 12 zuz because it was inferior dye. There's still an improvement of 2 zuz. Now, if that improvement was only 2 zuz, but the cost of it is actually 3 zuz, then what happens is that the dyer only gets the 2 zuz in terms of the improvement plus the 10 zuz for the wool. He doesn't get his retail fee of 20 zuz because he didn't use proper dye. So he would get it based on the market value of what that improvement would be with lousy or inferior dye. But if the expenses superseded the improvement, that's the loss to the dyer, because he was the one that created his own catastrophe. If the improvement exceeded the expenses, meaning that he dyed it with, let's just say, medium to low quality dye, so you would get 15 zuz for that quality of dyeing work instead of 20. But the person that brought in the product actually wanted high quality dye, and he stated so. Then we say, okay, then the improvement is 15 zuz. But if the expenses to get it to that point was the raw 10 zuz worth of the wool, plus an extra 2 zuz to use that inferior dye, and it only increased the value of the improvement by an additional 3, you only pay 12 zuz. Do you get what I'm saying, guys?
Yeah.
In other words, when somebody tries to snake you in business, they get the lower hand. So they get whatever's the worst amount. Is it the expenses that they incurred in doing the job poorly? Or is it the fact that the improvement is the low amount? Whichever's the low amount, that's what they get paid. How could the improvement be lower? Because he's downgraded the value by using inferior product. If his expenses were lower, then you only have to pay him for his expense. It's pretty straightforward. So we're going to start the Gemara now and just give an understanding of what's going on. Now, the Gemara obviously is focusing on this word, on that second word, if he dyed it poorly, etc. So the Gemara said, what do you mean he dyed it? For Rav Nachman said in the name of Rabbi Bava Kamma, it means that he dyed it with kalibus. So kalibus, I wasn't quite sure what it meant. I thought kalibus was some sort of vegetable, and what the heck it meant. So Rabbi Bashwal
sounds like cannabis, actually. But
yeah, said it was actually, it's the Hebrew word for a cauldron. So what does it mean, a cauldron? He wiped out the cauldron. There was residue dye left in the pots. And in other words, he'd been dyeing different dyes during the day. And the guy said he wanted high quality color of blue. But the guy's been dyeing sapphire blue, lightish blue, a bit of black, a bit of purple, etc. So that not only of the quality of the dyes diluted, but it's also got different hues in it. So that residue, if you, I suppose, add boiling water and you put in water, it will dye it, but it will certainly not be a homogeneous color. So, and it doesn't, it definitely, as Rashi says, doesn't have as deep a hue, and it consists of several different shades. So what happens then? So if you look at a brisa related to our Mishnah, the rabbis taught that if one gives pieces of wood, for example, to a carpenter to make a chair from, and instead of making a chair, he made a bench. Or he gave him pieces of wood to make a bench, and instead of making a bench, he made a chair. So what we're talking about there is a significant change. According to Rabbi Meir, as we know, it said the carpenter pays him the value. Why? Because you remember, the craftsman keeps the finished product for himself, because the physical change rendered at the acquisition of the craftsman, but he still has to reimburse the client for the original wood he put forth. Okay? But Rabbi Yehuda doesn't agree with that. He says if the improvement to the wood exceeds the expenses of making the chair or the bench, he pays the carpenter the expenses but not his fee. But if the expenses exceed the improvement to the wood, he pays the carpenter only for the improvement. So Rabbi Yehuda has got a different approach. He doesn't just replace the wood. He says that the calculation is, you can't, it's not as if it's a bench and it's an inferior bench. You made a completely different product. In that case, the craftsman is at a disadvantage, that he only gets paid the lesser, whether it be the improvement. In other words, what's the market related value of the chair that became a bench? What is that bench worth on the market? And also, what is the expenses? So probably because he made a bench instead of a chair, a bench is worth money. But however, because he didn't follow the instructions, he would only be paid probably the lower amount, which is the expenses to make the bench. Because if you make a different product, but it's still a higher quality product, obviously the improvement from the raw wood is going to be worth more. So you don't have to pay the carpenter for misunderstanding your instructions, just because he's made a beautiful bench when you asked for a chair. That's why this Gemara's got this added feature where you can pay not for the improvement from the raw wood. And when we say improvement, guys, we mean it what it's valued to. It only makes a qualitative difference with the dye, because there you've got high quality and lower, but you're still dealing with the same product. So it's still at a lower price point. But when you're making a completely different product, if it's made at a high quality, the original owner of the wood is losing out, because now he's going to have to pay the carpenter the higher fee for the improvement of a lovely, expensive bench. Client didn't want a bench, he wanted a chair. So then he can opt to pay for the expenses of what it cost the person to make that product, meaning his labor. Okay? And a couple of screws, etc. So that's why it allows for the flexibility of whatever's the lower amount. Okay. But Rabbi Meir agrees that with Rabbi Yehuda in one regard, that if he gave him a piece of wood and the carpenter was instructed to make a nice chair, and the guy made the world's ugliest chair. We gave him wood and he said, listen, just make a quality bench here, you know, for I would like an area for a dining room table, etc. And he made the world's ugliest bench. You couldn't use it as garden furniture. Then in that particular case, you don't replace the value of the wood. All you'd have to do then is actually pay either the improvement or the expenses of making the ugly chair or bench, but not for the raw wood. So you're saying, but how is that? Why is that case? Because simply you're not dealing with a physical change. That's what Rabbi Meir is saying. In other words, an ugly bench is still an ugly bench, whether it's a pretty bench or an ugly bench. So the carpenter didn't acquire the finished product through a physical change. So he can't simply pay for the wood and keep the finished product with its improvement, and then the carpenter benefit from it, because there was no physical change from the raw wood in the sense that he was asked to make a product. It has to, in order for the physical change to occur, it has to be that you've given an instruction for a chair and a bench was made, or a bench and a chair was made, or wool was dyed red instead of black, and vice versa. But when in fact it's an inferior product to that, even Rabbi Meir would agree with Rabbi Yehuda that there's not enough physical change to acquire it, because it's not a different article. It's just an inferior product. So therefore, the carpenter can't demand the full amount of his fee, because he is considered to have damaged the wood by making something ugly. So he's paid either his expenses with value of the improvement is less. So we're talking here that there's not really any other expenses apart from labor, a couple of screws, etc. So the Gemara now is asking for an inquiry as far as status of dye after it's applied to wool. So they inquired, is the improvement brought about by the dye ingredients? Could it something material on the wool? Is the improvement brought about by the dye ingredients not considered something material on the wool? So when I read about that, Kevin's going to make a pun, I thought, on the word material in wool. Am I right, Kevin? Something material on the wool. So I thought of you, Kev, when I learned that stuff. But what we are saying is here, is it something material? The question, guys, in essence, is whether the appearance is considered a significant factor or not, according to Rashi. In other words, if the fact that the dye's effect is visible and that coloration in the wool has added to the value, is it considered something tangible? Or since it's been absorbed into the wool, is it considered part of the wool and no longer a tangible product? Do you see the question or you don't? If you don't, you must ask me. I can clarify it a bit better because you've got to need to at least understand the question.
Are you talking, just repeat that, are you talking about the tangible, what, the color wasn't dyed according to instructions, or
no. So now we're learning a separate part. We learned about that. We said, all right, so say somebody steals dye and then they steal wool and then they dyed the wool. Do they owe for the dye and the wool? Let me just turn this one off. Sorry. Sorry, guys. So what I was saying is as follows: if Reuven steals from Shimon dye, and he also steals wool, and he decides to dye it, does he now, if Shimon claims for the dye and the wool, have to give him both because it significantly improved the wool, and it's that appearance has actually made a financial improvement to the value of the wool at the as well as the dye? Or is the dye insignificant in the fact that it might have added a bit of an appearance or coloration, but it hasn't added any financial value? That's what we're trying to determine. In other words, is the appearance of different color construed as an improvement in the sense that it's got financial added value or not? And the implication would be, if it has added value, he would have to pay that added value. Otherwise, does he owe for the dye, or just does he owe for the wool alone? That's the question. So let me just cover a little bit of ground. So what's the case in question? If you say the cases where someone robbed dye ingredients and he ground them and steeped them in water to produce dye, and then dyed his own wool with them, and the question is whether the original owner can demand their return. Okay? So in that case, the person had their own wool, okay? But all he did is steal the dye. Then the original owner of the dye is turned around and says, listen, I want my dye back. And basically, can the thief end up saying, listen, I don't know what you're talking about. It's part of the wool now. What do you expect me to do? Do you expect I can't give you the dye back? Am I entitled to give you the financial value of the dye or not, if it hasn't made any significant financial improvement? So that's the question, and the answer can be resolved pretty easily, because what you know is that if you're taking dye and it is almost in a solid form and you're grinding it and you're producing a powder and then a paste and you're putting liquid and then you're doing an absorption process, there is a physical change that went with the production. And then the question is moot, as the Gemara says, because the owner of the dye can't demand their return, because the physical change affects ownership for the thief. Okay? Now the question is the thief now entitled to the financial cash equivalent or not? So
Can I ask you to hold? Can I ask you to hold that? I've got the courier guy outside. I'm just running defect package.
Sure, I'll pause with a pleasure.
It won't be long.
Okay, so there's two questions. One is, if it's no longer that physical in existence, then do you in fact owe for it because you physically changed its properties? So the Gemara can't be stating, guys, that the thief doesn't pay him at all. It can't be that case. Why? Because we know that if the thief steals something and there's a physical change, he has to pay that amount in cash. It can't be that he gets off the hook just because you can't extract the dye from the wool. The Gemara isn't clear on that, but that's my guess. Because otherwise you could get away with everything on a physical change. I'm sure even in this case you'd have to pay it financially. Okay? So it's saying that, could you return the dye? Well, no, if it's physical appearance change. It's a moot point. It doesn't even resemble what it was. So the Gemara says the owner could surely not demand a return. So it obviously means a physical return of the dye, but I'm sure the cash equivalent it could. So it's indeed necessary to pose this question only in the case where one robbed dye ingredients that had already been seeped in water. In other words, guys, it means liquid dye, and then dyed his wool with them. Because if you take in liquid dye and that gets absorbed into wool, it hasn't changed its physical properties at all. So you have to already steal it in the format that it, in order to return that raw property. That's what it's asking. So it's saying, what's the law? Is the improvement brought about by the dye ingredients, in other words, the color, considered something material on the wool, something substantial? And thus the owner can say to the robber, give me back my dye ingredients that you took and now hold in possession. Perhaps the improvement brought about along by the dye ingredients is not considered something substantial in the wool, and the robber can say to the owner, there's nothing of yours by me whatsoever, and I'm not liable to return anything to you. Okay, so it's obviously evident, guys, from the statement of the Gemara that if the dye is considered to still be present, the robber hasn't acquired it through the physical change because it's just liquid dye and it's now been absorbed by the wool. So it's only for dyeing in this manner that it has any long-term existence. So anything that's changed from liquid dye to absorbed dye from its liquid form is not considered a significant change. And the owner, can he demand its return or not? That's what it's asking. Okay, obviously the cash equivalent, yes. So there's an obvious objection, and it's the Gemara raises it. Said, but look, if the improvement brought about by the dye ingredients is not considered something substantial on the wool, can the robber simply say to the owner, there's nothing of yours by me whatsoever, and be free of paying? Let the owner say to the thief, give me back the dye ingredients that you destroyed. Okay? Meaning when a stolen article no longer exists, the thief must still pay the owner the value. So even if the appearance is not considered legally significant, where it's improved the financial value, the dye's guy's not considered to be in existence, and the robber still has to pay for it because he paid for the dye, the original owner, and it's now destroyed. So consequently, we can't explain the relevance of whether the robber is liable or not, but he's certainly liable financially regardless. And even Rashi does bring a commentary on that. So the Gemara has to rephrase the point differently completely. It says, look, the point of the inquiry has to be explained in the following way. Okay? And that is the improvement brought about by the dye ingredients not considered something significant on the wool, and the robber must therefore pay him, since the stolen article is no longer in existence? Or perhaps the improvement brought about by the dye ingredients is considered something significant on the wool, and the robber can say to the owner, why your dye ingredients lie before you, take them. So in other words, the robbers turn around to him and say, well, extract them out. But there's something wrong with this interpretation. The Gemara says, well, what do you mean take it? Because you can't use detergent, as the Gemara says. Because detergent is only going to remove the dye from the wool. So there's no benefit to the robber, but it will never affect a return of usable dye to its owner. So the Gemara has to retract that interpretation and actually structures it finally like this. And it says, what are we dealing with here? We're in the case where he robbed wool and dye ingredients, which is in the form of liquid dye. Otherwise, physical change is not considered anything other than bringing back the cash value. And it was belonging to one person. In other words, we're saying here, number one, the wool didn't belong to the thief and he only stole the dye. He stole both the wool and the dye from the same person. And he dyed those wool with those dye ingredients, and he now returns the dyed wool to the owner for whatever reason. So the inquiry is as follows. In other words, if the wool is intact, and he decides to return it to the owner, I think either because the court made him or for whatever reason, then what we are asking is the wool still belongs to the original owner and the thief returned it to him. But according to the opinion that dyeing the wool does constitute a physical change to the wool, we can say that even though the thief doesn't return the wool, if he chooses to do so, the owner has to accept it from him. In other words, for the sake of simplicity, we can say that the robber didn't acquire the wool by dyeing it. And that view is actually adopted by halacha. So what does it mean? In other words, we're saying that there's a significant improvement to the wool or not. What we are saying is the bottom line is let the question be resolved on the basis that he has said that he's made the wool more valuable for the owner. Thus, even if the improvement to the wool is not considered something substantial and the robber must pay the owner for the dye, he has in effect done so by returning the wool to him and is now worth as much as the undyed wool and the dye combined. So all we are saying is here in very, very simple, that's a very complicated idea, and it's actually very, very simple. The dye's worth 5 zuz, the wool's worth 15 zuz. When you put them together and you return and you dye it, for whatever reason the court makes you return it, and you're a robber, so there's no twofold payment, do you then just give the dyed wool to the original owner and say, look, it's now improved to 20 zuz worth on the retail market, dye was worth 5, your untreated wool was worth 15, I've paid you back, I've just combined the two, and we're all good? Or do we say that there wasn't a significant improvement to the wool financially, so that the person has to return the dyed wool and still pay an extra 5 zuz? That's all we're saying. I don't know what has to make it so complicated, but that's all we're saying. Okay, so the Gemara answers the query is necessary only where the dye wool became cheap, so that the value of the improvement to the wool does not equal the value of the stolen dye. So what they are saying is there, in most cases, will have a correlation, because the market-related value would generally be the dye plus the wool. But and therefore, if you've returned the dye and the wool, you've hit the market-related view by combining them. And in that particular case, you don't have to pay extra for the dye as the robber. My question is a little bit different. Is firstly, that's not the case, because the profit relies on the profit made in between for the labor. Do you agree? You never buy raw ingredients and you combine 2 raw ingredients and that's your selling price. You add the labor of what it costs to add those 2 ingredients as your market-related service add value. Do you agree, guys?
Yeah.
But the reason why we don't add that is because the robber committed a crime. So let's say, for example, that dyed wool blue was worth 30 zuz, and your dye was worth 5 in liquid form, and your untreated wool was worth 15, and you put them together, and that's 20 zuz, but then the labor and the process made it worth 30. All you have to do is pay back the raw ingredients of the combined value, because the combined value doesn't leave the original owner at a financial loss. If anything, it's a gain. Why? Because it's worth 30 now on the market. So that's not even an issue I've worked out in the Gemara. So that's the robber's loss. But where there is an issue that the Gemara is bringing is where the dyed wool became super cheap, so that the value of the improvement to the wool does not equal the value of the stolen dye. Do you get what I'm saying? So in the commentary by Rashi, for example, the wool was worth 10 zuz and the dye's worth 3 zuz. Now, the value of the dyed wool declined and the wool is presently only worth 10 zuz, 11 zuz. So in other words, there seems to be a glut on the market that for that particular dye wool, it's not getting its valued worth. In other words, there's so much blue, it's actually become fashion nauseating. That it was last season's rage, and this season can't even get rid of it for love or money. So the thing is, there's actually a loss. That's when this question comes. So what do you do there? Do you say that, well, your value got absorbed in it and the robber can say sorry for your loss? Or does he have to pay the remainder due to the slump in the market in order to return the dye. Okay, in a case where there's no improvement. So if so the answer is, therefore, if the dye is no longer considered to exist, the robber must pay the owner for the dye. Do you get what I'm saying? Or if you prefer to say, if it's dropped in value, that the dye, in fact, is something significant because the person doesn't deserve to lose the value of his dye, even though the combined factors would have been in a normal market have covered the original owner. In a case where it doesn't, the robber has to make the shortfall. Make sense? Okay, there was a part of the Gemara that was funny where it says, or if you prefer to say, quarry is relevant to a case where the robber dyed a monkey with it, rather than wool, in which case the dye brought about no improvement in the monkey. Every now and again you read a line in the Gemara and you pack up laughing. Gav, have I lost you?
No, not at all. I'm just thinking ANC here.
Yeah. So in other words, the robber stole a monkey and dyed from the same person and dyed the monkey with the dye, and then returned the dyed monkey to its owner. The dye doesn't increase the value of the monkey. The robber's got no counterclaim for the improvement when he returns the monkey, because he can't turn around and say, listen, on the fashion market, this monkey's worth more. It's different if he stole he stole wool and he stole dye and he dyed it, and he said all of a sudden now it's worth more combined because people pay more for dyed material. The monkey has had no significant improvement whatsoever. And in this case, what happens in particular? Does he have to replace the dye or not? And in the above answer, it was the same thing. When there was a low in the market after the fashion trend of one color, now it's became oversaturated, excuse the pun, Kevin, with that particular fashion trend and dye in the market, does the robber have to pay the difference or not? So we're using that example now of the monkey. We've got about 3 minutes left. We'll come back to monkeys and dyes tomorrow. Now, I never thought I'd say that in a shiur. We're going to return to the subject of the monkey and the dye. All right.
Perfect.
All right. And on a serious note, is it tonight, Kevin, that we have? So why don't you teach us?
Science tomorrow. Science. Yeah.
Tomorrow at
short.
10, I think it is.
Okay,
Yes,
listen,
only,
I
yeah,
don't
tomorrow
have
at 10.
the same subject of monkey and dye when we're talking about the loss of so many people. I actually don't want it to be a funny part of the Gemara, really. So we'll choose a more somber topic.
Okay, so I've got an idea here. So in the previous parasha of Shmini, it talks about the animals, permitted animals for eating that we can eat, the land animals, the sea creatures, and the flying animals such as birds. And the main thing, I think, not to get confused, is that you can't eat something that's a predator like an eagle or a vulture or a crocodile or a snake or these types of animals. That's one thing that it's the easy way to remember. And if it looks gross, like a cockroach or a crab, you wouldn't, it just, in our mind, we should know you shouldn't want to even eat it in the first place. So, whereas you see a cow, and I know, sorry for the animal lovers that might be listening to the shiur, and disclaimer, yeah, if they get a cow or a sheep, they large creatures, they're placid creatures usually, and they eat vegetation. They don't hunt animals for their food. So so I think maybe when we were younger, we just knew that subconsciously, that even when we weren't fully kosher, we knew we wouldn't eat. We wouldn't eat these strange creatures who are predators and look gross. I mean, maybe it's just subconsciously we were born with a default to observe kashrut on whatever level.
No,
Just
not
thought of
everyone.
that. No, but you wouldn't eat.
No, no,
Gavin,
it's a
you
good
wouldn't
comment.
eat.
But
How's
I
that?
did eat. I did eat. What's it called? Prawns. Prawns
But
and
did you eat
lobster.
snake? Did you eat rattlesnake or wild boar?
I had snake once.
Yeah.
Bull maybe in America. I'm not sure.
Was it
I've
boring?
had, no, there used to be a place called the Baccarat in Rosebank where
Yes,
they had
that's right. Yeah,
all
yeah.
these dishes. They had it, but they put them in sauce, so you couldn't. They kind of all tasted like I've had crocodile and it
chicken.
tastes like
Yeah.
chicken. Most snake
Yeah.
also tastes a bit like chicken because they put them in all these wonderful sauces, but it
Yeah.
disguises the taste. You don't really know. They had every dish there. They had about 30 exotic things there. Quite a remarkable restaurant. Anyway, it's closed down now. We kosher. We can't have 90% of what's on that menu. In fact, nothing because none of it's kosher.